You can see this is the only verse from Jonah that we're covering today. Fear not. We will cover the majority of a chapter when Michael takes the reins next week. So we are still going to be covering ground. But I wanted to stay and hover here in Jonah 1:17 where it says, "And the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights." If you've ever read the VBS version or the Sunday school version of Jonah, this is what you remember, this moment right here. But I wanted to make sure we didn't forget about the 16 verses before this. So we have our friend Jonah. Who's Jonah? What can you tell me about Jonah?
Prophet.
He's a prophet.
Famous hero.
Yeah, he was a national hero of Israel. And what was he told to do at the beginning of this book?
Go rise to the enemy and talk to him.
That's right. Our favorite enemy, Nineveh. And when Jonah was told to go to Nineveh, he just went to Nineveh, right? That's obviously not. Otherwise, the story would be a lot shorter than even 4 chapters. So instead of heading towards Nineveh, he heads towards the port of Joppa to hitch a boat ride with a bunch of pagan sailors. And what happens when he hops on the boat with a bunch of pagan sailors?
Storm.
That's right. Jonah is taking a little snooze down in the bottom of his boat, and a big old storm. I don't have a storm, so use those imaginations, folks. Big old storm comes and threatens to break up the boat. Like that. But it doesn't. What do the sailors do when the storm comes?
They
Wake everyone up and say, pray to your God.
That's right. They get Jonah out and they say, all right, everybody, start praying. And so then they get out the dice and they throw the dice, cast lots, and they say, we're going to see whose fault this is. And of course it falls on our dear friend Jonah, Yahtzee. And so they say, who are you, Jonah? And Jonah says, I am.
The servant of the Most High God.
Yeah. He said, I am a Hebrew and I worship Yahweh, the maker of the earth and the sea. And then the sailor's response is, even greater fear. They start panicking. They say, what have you done to us? So what does Jonah say you got to do? Throw me overboard. And being the nice guys that they are, they say, no chance, Jonah. I'm not going to throw you in. They get the oars and they start trying to paddle for shore. Say, we are not going to throw you in to this certain death trap ocean in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea in the midst of a storm that's about to break up our boat. We're not going to do that. We don't want that blood on our hands. And they try to row, and finally they realize it just ain't going to happen. So they say, Yahweh, forgive us for what we're about to do. And they chuck him overboard. And then, as our wonderful verse has told us, the storm calms, the sailors rejoice and worship God, and God appoints a big old fish to swallow our buddy Jonah. And we will leave our good buddy Jonah in the belly of that whale, fish, sea creature, to marinate for a week.
At least.
3 days and 3 nights in the actual story. We're going to leave him there for a whole week. Really make sure that stench works its way in to his hair. Okay. Obviously, the silliness of the magnets is fun. I hope the visuals will help us continue to track forward as we rewrite the story that those pictures told to us the last time we saw them. If you remember, those are the same illustrations and images used from the kids' video we opened our series with that leaves out some pretty significant moments from the book of Jonah, namely most of chapter 2 and all of chapter 4 of a 4-chapter book. So we want to finish the story out, and we'll use our visuals along the way as well. Okay, now we get into this week's. So last week we left ourselves with when we understand what our sin deserves, which is death, and how much bigger our God is than our sin, there's only one right response, which is worship. That's what we saw the sailors doing when they realized what Jonah's sin deserved was death. Storm comes, rips up the boat, all of that. Then they realize how big God is, Yahweh is, when they throw him in the ocean and the storm is calmed. The only right response they could come up with is to worship him. They make sacrifices and vows to the Lord. So Jonah did not do that, but instead finds himself deep in the belly of a whale. So we gotta start with the elephant, which is not an elephant, but is actually a great fish. There is so much conversation. And you heard me probably 3 or 4 different words talk about this creature earlier. Is it a fish? Is it a whale? Is it a monster? Is it a goldfish left out of the bowl too long? I do not know what it is, but let's dive in a little bit more to see what we can find here. So the truth is that Jonah is written in Hebrew. There is no Hebrew word for whale. So there's a chance this could be whale. The only other, so there's a word for fish, which is what's used here, gad, and then there is one other word for a sea creature of any kind, and it's leviathan. If you've read your Bible, in the scarier bits of the Bible, you might have encountered leviathan, this massive sea monster. That word is not used here, but those are the only 2 words in Hebrew that would conjure up an image of something big in the ocean. This great fish or leviathan. So this great fish term is a lot more generic than what our biological definition of fish would be. This does not mean that it's a cold-blooded, gill-having, scale-toting creature of the sea necessarily. Absolutely could be. That's in the range of outcomes. It's a more generic word than that. Now, this is not the only time that this scene is talked about. We've looked several times at Matthew 12:40. Let's look again at when Jesus references this story. So this is from Matthew 12:40. It says, "For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." Now, New Testament is written in Greek, not Hebrew. So you get a different word here. And our word, your Greek word of the day if you want one, is katos. So there is a perfectly acceptable and normal word for fish in Greek. In fact, it comes up a lot throughout the course of the New Testament because a handful of the disciples are fishermen, after all. They know fish. They grew up in a region of a lot of fishing in Galilee, that northern part of Israel, absolutely. They would have known their fish. And yet Jesus does not use that word for fish. He chooses instead this way less common word of katos. And you're like, well, what on earth is katos? And when you look at other Greek literature, I mean, think back to like Greek mythology, if you ever had to read that in school and the different things of that. This word katos, you talk about Perseus is out here fighting gigantic sea monsters. That's when katos is used. So does that mean that the fish, this great fish in Jonah, is some sort of Loch Ness monster copycat? Not necessarily. It just means what we do know is this is a large aquatic creature. That's about as far down as I'm willing to go. This could just as easily be a sperm whale as it could be a whale shark, as it could be any of the other things you could conceive of in the ocean. Just remember, this is back in ancient times when they did not have submarines and they did not have underwater cameras and they did not have scuba gear. So they didn't do a ton of deep sea exploration. They knew fish, they were fishermen, they were not ignorant people, but there was a lot of mysteries in the Mediterranean Sea at this time. So when you see something big in the water, it's the great fish. Just plaster it right on there and move along. What I don't want us to get overly caught up in is this conversation of, well, we need to know precisely what this creature was in order to know, could Jonah have actually survived for 3 days and 3 nights inside of this creature without dying? Because I think if you hone in on that, you've missed the most important words in our verse from today, which would be that the Lord appointed. There's your miracle right there. The miracle is less so what creature and more so who sent the creature.
Yeah, mine says God prepared.
Yeah, absolutely. Whether it's prepared, appointed, or I'm trying to think of what the other one was that came up in my text this week, whatever word you have there is intentionality from God in getting this creature to this location at this time. This is a sovereign ruling act of God, showing again in such a short chapter how much control he has over nature. Not only did he send the storm, but he was also able to turn it off in an instant. And then he also has controls over creatures we couldn't even identify at this time. The Lord is mighty. The fish might get top billing in the kids' Bible, but don't miss the fact that it's God who provides the transportation for Jonah to get from disobedience to obedience's shoreline. Takes him all the way over there. This is a miracle. This whole scene of God appointing the fish to be here at this time and God sustaining Jonah for the 3 days and 3 nights that he's in there. To try and explain a miracle which is supernatural with natural means, I think you're always going to find yourself falling a little short. Could we sit there and debate other historical accounts of sailors being swallowed by large sea creatures and surviving? Absolutely. There's probably, I think in my research, I came across 3 or 4 different accounts of something like this happening. Not for as long as Jonah's reported to be in there, but you're just not, I think you're spinning your wheels on the wrong thing here. Because if you're needing to explain this miracle, then I think you're forgetting the much more significant big miracle that's tied to this. Because there's a phrase here, I'll use my pen, I guess, 3 days and 3 nights. Ring any bells in your this side of Jesus ear? This is not an inconsequential amount of time, and Jesus doesn't think so either. Because when we come back up here, just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so the Son of Man, who's Jesus, will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Jesus is drawing a direct parallel here. It's intentional to say, Jonah was a precursor to me in a lot of ways. That's what we're exploring in this entire series, how Jesus is the better Jonah. Just what he says, I didn't put the verse in here this week, but in verse 41 right after this, he says, for behold, someone greater than Jonah is here now. Speaking to those scribes and Pharisees who he is in front of here. This is a far more impressive and significant miracle to believe in, the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, than the almost death and semi-resurrection of Jonah from the belly of the fish. So don't get caught up on having to explain away every part of this miracle in Jonah, because there's even bigger miracles we're going to have to get our minds around. And it's very foundational to your relationship with God and ultimately your eternal standing, is how you believe the story of the resurrection. So don't let that get out in front of the main point here. What I see as being the primary teaching from this one verse in Jonah is that God's will is always accomplished, whether it matches your will or not. Because like we've talked about, and like we just went back over, Jonah had laid out pretty clearly what his will was. He had decided, God's told me to go to Nineveh. So I'm going in the opposite direction. Remember where Tarshish was located? He hops on a boat trying to go to Tarshish. So he goes south to Joppa to get on a boat, and then he heads to the westernmost part of the known world, to Tarshish. And where was Nineveh in relation to Israel? To the north and to the east. He was going the exact opposite direction. It was purposeful disobedience, running the wrong way. And yet God's will is going to be accomplished. We know the story. We know where Jonah's going to end up. He's going to end up in Nineveh. That's what God told him all the way back in the first verse. He said, arise and go to Nineveh. And he's going to get there. He's going to get to Nineveh. What I want us to take a quick look at is the will of God. I made a flow chart for us. Everyone ooh and awe together. Oh, thanks for making me feel so good. Okay. Can you guys read that okay? Good. Looks like it actually showed up. I'm grateful for that. Okay. So I'll do my best to kind of walk through it with us. So starts at the top. This is the Doing God's Will flow chart, and it kind of shows us several examples through Scripture. We'll walk through them together here. So first, God communicates His will to you. Do you obey? Great. The will of God is accomplished. You've done it. Path 1, executed. Just like Noah did. So God says, build an ark. His will is made clear. What does Noah do? Well, he doesn't piddle around. He builds an ark. Obedience, great, the will of God's accomplished. Okay, so head back to do you obey? What if you're not as good as Noah and you disobey? Well, the next question that comes up is, well, is God going to go on with you or without you? This is God's decision here. If He chooses to go on without you, well, now someone or something else does what you were meant to do. This would be the story of Deborah and Barak. Speaking of things that get cut from children's Bibles, let's go together to Judges 4, verses 4 through 10. So I'll read this for us. I'll add a little bit of what happens afterwards, because again, this may not be the most readily available story in your Rolodex of Bible narrative. So from Judges 4:4 it says, now Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at that time. She used to sit under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. And the people of Israel came up to her for judgment. She sent and summoned Barak, the son of Abinoam, from Kadesh Naphtali, and said to him, has not the Lord, the God of Israel, commanded you, go gather the men at Mount Tabor, taking 10,000 from the people of Naphtali and the people of Zebulun, and I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army. And this is the army of the Canaanites, so the enemies of Israel. And so the general of Jabin's army to meet you by the river Kishon with his chariots and his troops, and I will give him into your hand. Remember, she's the mouthpiece of God here. She's speaking on behalf of God. So God has promised to give over the Canaanite general into the hands of Barak, who is an Israelite general and leader. Now go with me to verse 8. Barak said to her, if you will go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. And she said, I'll surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory. For the Lord will sell Sisera, that general, into the hand of a woman. Then Deborah arose and went with Barak to Kadesh. And Barak called out Zebulun and Naphtali to Kadesh, and the 10,000 men went up at his heels, and Deborah went with him. What happens after this, it spans several more verses, so I decided to summarize it for you here, is the battle commences. The enemy general, Sisera, ends up kind of in a pickle, and he's running away, and Jael, this young lady, says, come into my tent to hide. Comes into the tent to hide. She busts out a tent peg to the head, and Sisera is Sisera. He is dead. You like that one? It's Father's Day. I'm not a dad, but I thought I'd co-op the dad joke. You're welcome. So now that we've got a dead guy with a tent peg holding him to the ground, we can see how God chose to still accomplish his will, which was the defeat of the Canaanite army and the death of the Canaanite general Sisera. He still accomplishes his will. We've still made it over to our red box finish line here, but accomplished it without Barak. It was Barak's job. It was originally given to him to kill this general. But because it's not given us, I guess, the exact motives, but what it seems to be illustrating is because he didn't have enough trust in the power of God to do this thing, he said, no, I need God's prophetess and judge with me in order to feel safe doing this. God takes that away from him, gives it to someone else. So that's the path that looks like without. And yet, the will of God's still accomplished. So move down another one. So again, will God go on with or without you? Let's see if he chooses to go with you, continues to use you despite your disobedience. God confronts your disobedience. Now, how will you respond? Will you respond willing to participate with him or unwilling to participate with him? Let's start with willing. Oh, I lost my pen. So for willing, better late than never. Now you do the job God has for you. And guess what? Great, the will of God's accomplished. This would be the story of Samson. In case it's been a minute, let me give you the last part of Samson. You're probably familiar with the first part of it. Mighty, strong man of God, dedicated by his mother to the Lord for two things. One, to be holy. He is dedicated with the Nazirite vow. So he's supposed to be particularly set aside and holy to God. And he's supposed to judge Israel. And what that means in this time is we're not talking get up on the stand and get your gavel out. We're talking about judging Israel means ruling the people of Israel via the power of God. And that in the book of Judges almost always looks like casting out some sort of enemy nation who is oppressing Israel because the Israelites have disobeyed God. And it goes in this cycle. They disobeyed God. God sends an enemy nation to oppress them. The people cry out. God sends a judge to rescue them, restores peace to the nation of Israel. The people celebrate and rejoice. Then they rebel against God again. God sends an enemy nation. We continue back around the Ferris wheel. So Samson is supposed to stay holy, and he's supposed to get rid of, at this time, the Philistines who are oppressing the people of Israel. He doesn't do either of those very well. Because throughout the course of his story, while he is this very strong warrior who does defeat a lot of Philistines, he continues to break purity law after purity law after purity law laid out in the book of Leviticus. He is consistently breaking his Nazirite vow. He's holding on to this one thing, which is that a razor shall never touch his hair. And he even compromises on that by telling Delilah, hey, if you cut my hair, I'll lose my strength. Haircut, it's not because the hair was magic, it's because of his vow to God. He's broken his vow to God. God removes the blessing from Samson, and he's left weak enough for the Philistines to capture him. They gouge out his eyes, and he's now their prisoner, which takes us to this final scene from Judges 16:27 through 30. Now the house was full of men and women. All the lords of the Philistines were there, and on the roof there were about 3,000 men and women who looked on while Samson entertained. Then Samson called to the Lord and said, O Lord God, please remember me and please strengthen me only this once, O God, that I may be avenged on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. And Samson grasped the 2 middle pillars on which the house rested, which he was shackled to at this time. And he leaned his weight against them, his right hand on the one and his left hand on the other. And Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. And then he bowed with all his strength, and the house fell upon the lords and upon the people who were in it. So the dead whom he killed at his death were more than those whom he had killed during his life. So do you see we're not going to do an in-depth study on Samson right now. It's a great story that deserves appropriate treatment. But the 2 things I want you to see is that he redevotes himself to the Lord, that he's crying out, oh Lord God, oh God, remember me, strengthen me. He's leaning on the Lord again. He can't go back and undo the impure things that he did to break his Nazirite vow, but he turns back to the God who he had served and was supposed to be judging on behalf of. And then look at the consequence of what happens. That the ones that he killed during his death were more than those whom he killed during his life. Finally fulfilling his purpose as judge of Israel, which is ushering in the time of peace by driving out the Philistines. He may not see the task fully completed, but he takes a pretty big chunk out of the pie, it seems. Because if you read the full story of Samson, the amount that he killed during his life was not a small number of Philistines. So this is a tremendous amount that he kills here in this one moment. So you can see when he chooses to be a willing participant in the correction that God's given him by taking away the blessing, allowing the Philistines to overpower him. When he becomes this willing participant, he ends up, don't look at that yet. It's coming later. He becomes a conduit to accomplish the will of God. So great, the will of God is still accomplished. But now let's just see if you go all the way down and you are at the bottom of the flow chart here. God confronts your disobedience. How will you respond? Unwillingly. Well, guess what? God will work in spite of you. Think about Pharaoh in the book of Exodus. What's that phrase that time and time again he says to Moses? Moses says, let my people go. And he says, no, I will not let your people go. Sounds pretty stubborn and unwilling to me. Time and time again, plague after plague, continues to say the same things. He even does like a takesy-backsy at one point. He's like, go ahead, just kidding, you can't go. Only to come to the end where God finally works in spite of him. Yes, Pharaoh does eventually have the words leave his lips, get out of my sight, after his firstborn dies. God worked in spite of him. Speaks about how first it says Pharaoh hardens his own heart. Later it says God hardens Pharaoh's heart. In the course of that narrative, what we see here is God saying, look, you're not going to be a part of the program here? Fine, I'll harden your heart too. And guess what? We're just going to circumvent you because you could have let my people go, would have spared you a lot of heartache. And yet, even with the hardest road for a person to walk through, the will of God is still accomplished. No matter whether you obey or disobey, no matter whether God chooses to do it with or without you, no matter if you're willing or unwilling in the situation, God's will is going to be accomplished. Jonah learned that one. Well, we learn that too. In fact, speaking of our good friend Jonah, I want you guys to discuss this at your table for a second. I'll zoom back in on our chart here for you guys. Using this flow chart, where would you guys say that Jonah is on his journey right now? In the belly. So don't tell me where he's going to be in chapter 3, chapter 4. I want to know where he's at right now at the end of chapter 1. Okay, take some time at your tables to discuss that, of where you feel like he slots in the flow chart. All right, let's bring it back in. I heard some good talks. I'd love to hear. By the way, it's okay if you guys have different perspectives on where you end up. I'll share my perspective too, and I think we all know where he's going as well, and that's, I think, the more interesting conversation. So we might revisit this in a few weeks, but what do you guys think? Which table wants to start?
Kind of looks like how you kind of look at it.
Mm-hmm.
Could be like in the third one down.
Yeah.
Where God confronts him.
Yeah.
And it depends on how he responds, but he doesn't really have control at that point, because
Right. Has he had the opportunity to be willing or unwilling?
He's going to walk out as Dan said, feet don't fail me now, don't work right now.
Yeah, in the belly of a whale, he can't go far.
But also you could look at it, he's down there at the very bottom. God's going to do it in spite of him, because he's in a place now where he doesn't have the final decision what's going to happen.
Sure.
God has that decision. God put him in this big old belly down there, and like I was saying, I don't like sushi, so I know that place stinks.
That would,
So,
yeah, that would be
it's not
quite the smell.
cut bait and go fishing situation.
You are bait and you are fishing.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. What'd you guys get over here? What'd you think?
We think he's a little higher than that he's in the disobedience
Mm-hmm.
stage still. And so God's going to move forward with or without him. And so he's in that second triangle or diamond there.
Yeah.
We know how it's going to unfold going down, but at this point we don't know that. And so we're leaving him in that second
Yeah,
triangle.
I think those are both totally good answers. Yeah.
Like he's in the third.
Yeah, and I would agree with
I think he's in the third.
whatever perspective you put on it. I think he has to be.
But he's not in the first one.
Yeah, let's say where he's definitely not. He's clearly not obeying. We can cross that one smooth out. We can say he's not a Noah. I would argue the fact that God sends the fish is enough sign to say that he is choosing to do it with Jonah rather than without. Which makes me think you could have him in 2 there, and I think that that's perfectly acceptable. I just think that the fact that he sends the fish rather than just allowing Jonah to die, or allowing Jonah to go to Tarshish, to just say, all right, dude, you missed out, tough luck. Instead, he chooses to what was our word earlier? Appoint a fish to appoint Jonah to the shoreline. So I think you could say the presence of this fish, I would say, I find him right here, that you could either say the storm or the fish would be the confrontation, but I think that's about as far as I'm willing to go right now. I wouldn't go all the way to the bottom with spiting yet, because I think we need to look and see how Jonah now responds, because we haven't, like you said, we haven't really had the opportunity to see Jonah's response to this confrontation. Even if you view the storm as the confrontation, we saw a disturbing lack of response from Jonah, actually. Very little as far as insight into how Jonah's truly feeling about the storm and all that stuff. Very expressive sailors, very stoic Jonah. So I think you find yourself probably in that third diamond, somewhere between 2 and 3, I think is great. Yeah.
Based on where we stopped, he's actually moving out of 2, into 3, not quite there.
You put him right here on that width line? Yeah. I love it. Look at that. We call it compromise. Put him right there. I love it. Okay. So this conversation about God's will being accomplished no matter what our will is, like even if our will does not agree with God's will, it raises some complicated and difficult questions. If God's in control of everything, then am I in control of anything? Or am I just a puppet? Is Jonah just a puppet here? Who's just, don't really matter what you do, Jonah, you're going to end up in Nineveh. Don't matter what you do, what decisions you've made to this point, you're going to end up preaching to the Ninevites. Is that what this is saying? So disclaimer, before we start this conversation, super smart people have debated about this very topic, about how much freedom and control do we have in our lives, and how much control does God have over life and all of the things. It's been debated by very smart people for a long time. This is not the place to debate that. Instead, I want us to have a look at what Jonah has to teach us about this topic. And if you want to have deeper discussions later, I was a philosophy minor. I would love to go get coffee or lunch and discuss it more with you. I love chewing on these things. We probably will not chew on it satisfactorily for some of you guys today, and we'll probably chew on it too much for some others of you today. So we're going to walk in the middle of that together. All of these stories from our flowchart, and definitely not excluding Jonah, show us that we definitely have a choice in what we do and in the decisions that we make. Meaningful decisions that all have consequences, like how Noah chooses to obey God, and so he and his family end up on the inside of the ark rather than the outside of the ark. Meaningful decisions like Barak choosing to chicken out, and now Jael's called in to do this. Samson choosing to repent as he's chained up here rather than just be entertainment and eventually tortured to death by the Philistines. Pharaoh choosing to be stubborn, and we get this beautiful picture of the Passover as the lamb's blood is shed and put on the doorposts as a coming sign of Jesus, who would be our ultimate Passover lamb. These choices are significant and have real consequences, and they are the decisions of these individuals. In the story of Jonah, he clearly chose to go to Joppa and clearly chose to get on a boat and clearly chose to tell the sailors that I worship Yahweh. Hey, by the way, throw me in the ocean so that maybe it'll kill me. All of these things are choices that Jonah has made that impact his life and this story. What this story demonstrates in Jonah is that Jonah does have a will, but that his will is not bigger than God's will. While he makes all of his own choices, Jonah fails to bring about his own will of what he wants to see accomplished and done, which is a vacation on the west coast of Tarshish. And instead, he's not powerful enough to accomplish that and to overcome God's storm that he sends in order to accomplish the divine will of God. So how can it be true that God is in this total control of what we see to this point, of the powers of nature, the fish, the storm, all of these things? How can he be in control of all of that? And how can we still be in control of our own actions? I don't know the mechanisms of that. However, what I do know is that both have to be true according to the Bible, because we see way too many instances of both, where it clearly says, yes, human beings have the ability to make decisions, and in fact, we often make really bad decisions. And yet, the will of God is, like we see, always accomplished. So what do we do with that? How can we hold these seemingly contradictory views at the same time?
No, actually, the will of God was that he would willingly go to Nineveh. And that didn't happen. It took God's intervention. So, the storm, the fish.
I'd push back a little bit. I don't know that it was clearly stated that God's will is that Jonah would be a willing participant. His will is that condemnation would be preached to the Ninevites, because that's what he says to Jonah. He says, arise, go to Nineveh and preach against them, or call out against them, for their sins have offended me. So I think what we can definitely say is that his will was that Jonah would go and preach. And I think his desire, which we see illustrated throughout Scripture, his desire is obedience, that we would be part of the program, But I don't know if we can quite say that, yes, it was his will that Jonah would obey. But it's an interesting conversation.
I wonder if it's, God didn't choose anybody else, so Jonah had everything that God needed for somebody to have to preach to these people,
Right.
to get their attention. But Jonah first had to be broken.
Yeah,
His own will had to be broken.
absolutely. And I think that what we see here, because if you remember, and I am stepping into the world of biblical speculation here, but I think the text supports this. What we know about Jonah was that he was this national hero of Israel, because back in 2 Kings, it talks about how he prophesies in favor of Israel's expansion. They were going to get this territory from Assyria, which is the country that Nineveh is a city in. Ooh, don't fall asleep on me. No, don't fall asleep on me. So this is the country that Jonah's prophesied against, Assyria, and he's prophesied in favor of Israel. So it's a big deal when God tells him, hey, I need you to go to Assyria and preach to them. Because now God is asking him to put on the line everything that makes Jonah valuable in his own eyes. his whole standing with his countrymen, the thriving of his nation. Assyria's on the ropes right now. Jonah's like, hey, you've never asked another prophet to go to a pagan nation to go preach to it. I know that you're going to try to do something here. So he said, no thanks. I'm not going to do that. I think that what you pointed out to us is he needed to have his will broken because his will was to sin. And it was to worship the prosperity of Israel over the instruction and obedience to the Lord. And so this is God's way of saying, no, don't forget who's God here. It's me. What I say is what you do. When you prophesy for the expansion of Israel, you didn't prophesy that because it was good for Israel. You prophesied it because I told you to. Because I'm the one who blessed Israel in this moment, because they cried out to me and I heard their cries. Now I'm telling you to preach to the enemies of Israel. You don't get to decide that your idea is better than mine. It's not. So I think that that's about as good a reason as any to see why God would choose to continue to use Jonah here. Because Jonah is the exact person who needs to go through this journey to have his view of God rightly aligned again. As a prophet of God, he needs to have that rightly aligned again. So if we have these seemingly contradictory views of God being in control of everything, and yet we still have control over what we do in our actions and our will, how do we hold that? You hold it in tension. Now, when you hear someone say in tension, the first thing that I think of is like tension in my shoulders, right? Oh, we're going to have to be stressed about this. And that's not what I mean. When I say hold it in tension, I think of it in terms of a musical instrument with a string. It has to be held in the right amount of tightness. Think about a violin. I don't know if any of you guys ever played violin before. There's actually, like a guitar only has one peg up at the top for each string that you use to tune it. A violin has two, one at the top and one at the bottom. So the top is the major tuning peg, and then you've got the fine tuning peg down at the bottom that's used to really dial it into the right note. What we need to be doing is saying, this belief about the will is held between two extreme points. God is in control, and yet we still have control over our actions. And we need to dial in those dials in order to get the right note. And guess what? You're probably going to be working those little dials for the rest of your life. And that's okay. This is part of what it looks like to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. Is it looks like continuing to know God better and better and better, continuing to know how he designed us better and better and better. This idea of two contrary things being true at the same time kind of brings up this image that you weren't supposed to see earlier. Guys, what do you see here? A rabbit. Raise your hand if you saw a rabbit first.
Oh, I seen a bird.
Yeah, does anyone see a duck? Okay, yeah. So show of hands, who saw the duck first?
Who saw both?
Who saw?
Yeah.
This is one that's been used and used and used. If you've ever been to a corporate seminar or a professional development of any kind, it's shown up. It showed up for me in grade school. It's all over the place. Logically, this picture cannot be of both a rabbit and a duck. Those are not the same animal. It has to be one or the other. And yet, I can clearly see a duck and a rabbit. So what is this a picture of? A rabbit that looks like a duck or a duck that looks like a rabbit? The most correct answer
It's a shape.
is that this was drawn to be both a duck and a rabbit. This didn't happen by accident. The artist drew it with an intention of both of those seemingly contradictory things being true at the same time. Some people may see a duck primarily and have to be shown the rabbit, and others might be just the opposite. It's the same thing for us in this conversation of, we'll use the big word, the sovereignty of God, that God is sovereign and ruling and reigning over everything, that he's in control, and our free will, our ability to choose freely to obey or disobey God, to do different things. Both those things held together in tension, even if it makes your brain itch while you try to hold them in tension, like seeing the duck and the rabbit at the same time. We hold both of those together, even if you find yourself saying, well, naturally, it's easy for me to see the sovereignty of God. It's hard for me to see our will in this. Or vice versa. Well, it's obvious I have will. I have a really hard time with seeing a God who's in control of all this stuff. You stretch yourself to both. You hold it in tension. Hold both points. It's difficult, and we're going to continue to tune and fine-tune your understanding of this. I understand it better today than I did 5 years ago. And I hope that I understand it even better in 40 years from now. I'm not convinced I'll ever have it understood until I am on the other side of eternity and can see it more from God's perspective on this. And I'm sure it'll be perfectly clear when he illustrates it for us. Right now, I just don't know if I have enough ammo in a capacity to understand things to fully grasp how they work together as a mechanism. And yet, should that worry us? Because of the mystery of God here. I know the mystery of God can be a difficult thing, but if our God was small enough to be understood by the human mind, he wouldn't be big enough to be worshiped as God. It's important that the human mind cannot fully conceive of everything that God has to offer us, because otherwise he's not big enough. Yeah, Mark?
During my somewhat early years of a Christian, we were discussing the same thing. And the way I heard it, that to me fits the best, is above the entrance says, whosoever will. Once you go in and you took a look back, above it says, those who were predestined.
It's a beautiful illustration.
Not up to me to figure it out.
And I am so grateful that that's not my job. It's not my job to figure it out. It's my job to faithfully follow the one whose job it is. So, if you need the outer bounds of what's acceptable for your tuning pegs in order to have an appropriate note, how much free will do we have? More than a programmed robot, less than God. Somewhere in that very broad zone, we can have a conversation about. And how much sovereignty does God exercise? Well, he's in control of everything, but he is not dictating everything because we still are able to choose things. So it's got to be somewhere in those bounds.
And God does not cause us to sin.
Exactly right. Somewhere in those bounds, we're willing to have conversations. If you're outside of those bounds, probably not ready to have the conversation on this. It needs a little bit more time in the Word, marinating on it. There's probably a deeper disagreement there that needs to be handled. Okay, so now we look to Jesus and we put the duck bunny away. Jesus on the flow chart never made it further than the first level down. He always obeyed. Always. What we see here is a scene in the Garden of Gethsemane from Luke 22. And he came out and went, this was Jesus, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. And when he came to the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not enter into temptation." And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw and knelt down and prayed, saying, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." And there appeared to him an angel from heaven, strengthening him. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. Jesus, as a person who is fully human, just like us, had a human will, and he expresses it here. He says, "Father, if there's any other way, make it not this one." And yet, Jesus, being fully God, chose to follow the divine will, which was that he would go to the cross and that he would endure all that came with the cross, which is the embarrassment and the shame and the pain and inevitably the death, but also the bearing of all of the sin that creates separation that we experience. He feels all of that and bears all of that. He didn't want it. And yet he's willing to say, "Not my will, but yours be done." Yes, we know Jesus is God. We're not renouncing the Trinity here. Yes, that's very complicated to understand in this context. Another point of tension to take home with yourself today. That one's free. Look at what it says in Hebrews from chapter 12. Therefore, since we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that's set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. I don't know about you, but that joy that was set before him doesn't quite help me reconcile with the agony that he felt that led to great drops of blood falling to the ground as he prayed. Question just for the room, what was the joy set before Jesus that he was willing to endure? What do you guys think? Tell me. What was the joy set before Jesus?
I mean, it's the joy of the father and the prodigal son. It's the joy of Noah running aground. It's the joy of Jonah getting spat back onto the land. It is the very singular essence of hope itself. It's the joy of after death life.
Seeing someone move from a hopeless existence of death into life eternal. That's the joy that Jesus had set before him. The same joy, I'm sure, that the sailors felt when the storm is calmed. We're going from certain, so to a more limited extent, we're headed for certain death in this storm, and then the storm calms, and they make sacrifices to God and they worship him. That's the same brand of joy. Jesus saw that in our future. He saw that for the generations of people to come, for the generations behind him, that he was going to endure that. Even though the great agony of what he was about to endure was still set before him, he knew that he could go on because of the joy that was set before him.
The people were going to be broke from the law and no longer under the law.
Absolutely. And the freedom that comes from that, it's a beautiful thing. If you're a Christian, you too should look to Jesus. Set aside your will and follow God's will. What we know about God's will is that it's completely informed and it's completely good because God is both perfect in knowledge and he's perfect in goodness. So you can trust that his will has all the needed information and all the goodness. However, our will, what we know about our will is it's only partially informed. You know how many times I've made a decision not knowing what was on the calendar on Thursday? Partially informed what I'm deciding to do. And it's only sometimes good because I also know how I make decisions. It's not always good reasons. Because we are limited in our knowledge and our goodness. So when it comes down to deciding between do I follow my will or follow God's will, we should feel very secure in choosing to follow God in what he has told us to do, because it's a much better version of our will. On our best days, when we're the most informed and the most good, we might get close to the will of God. If we're not consulting and asking him, we might, in that kind of way that a blind squirrel still finds a nut, we might just find our way into near the will of God. But praise God, he doesn't leave us blind to his will. He reveals it in two different ways to us. He gives us a general way through his word. There is so much of his instruction to us in this book and what his will is for those who follow him. And the second way is through his Spirit, a more specific way. Maybe it's the Spirit of the Lord that dwells in his people, who speaks to you in a particular circumstance that says, hey, go here, do this. Not too dissimilar to how God spoke to his prophets. Not may be exactly the same, but it is a personal God speaking to an individual saying, hey, go here, do this. God reveals his will to those who seek it. There's one place you can always find it, and there's one person you can always ask about it. Holy Spirit of God. Look at Jonah. He lives outside God's design for his life, and he suffers for it. There's no worse place to be than outside the will of God. It's like trying to swim against a riptide. If you've ever grown up in an ocean setting or been in an ocean setting, my deepest, darkest fear is a riptide because I'm not a particularly strong swimmer, especially since I threw my shoulder out in college. If I get caught in a riptide, I'll see y'all on the other side. No diagonal swimming is going to get the job done. But you can swim as hard as you want against the pull of this current that's pulling you deeper and deeper into the ocean. And all it's going to accomplish is wearing you out. Pitting your will against the will of God, just like Jonah saw, it's just going to make your life harder, more difficult, more painful than if you went with the will of God. Remember the flow chart. Noah's life looked a little bit better than Jonah's. It looked a lot better than Pharaoh's. Does that mean that living in the will of God excuses you from all pain and suffering? No. You don't have to read very far in God's word to see that either. Look no further than Jesus. Pain and suffering is promised in this life and in this world because we live in a broken world. So even if it's not consequences for your sin, there's still consequences of sin in the world that we endure. The sailors were not the reason the storm came to the boat. And yet, they were just as much in danger of dying in that storm as Jonah was, even though their guilt is not what caused that storm to come about. That's part of life. But being in the will of God is always better than being outside of the will of God.